When a troubled teenager, Elijah Moore, finds himself in juvenile court, Judge Robert Calloway sees him as just another lost cause. Mocking the boy's lack of legal knowledge, the judge is unaware that Elijah has spent months secretly studying courtroom tactics with the help of his attorney neighbor, Mr. Whitmore. What starts as a routine hearing takes a shocking turn when Elijah begins defending himself in a way no one expected. Like the video and subscribe so you never miss a story. The air in the small Georgia courtroom felt thick with judgment. Judge Robert Calloway peered down from his bench, his eyes brimming with impatience as he scanned the docket. Another teenager in trouble. Another waste of the court's time. Elijah Moore, the judge read aloud, his voice laced with boredom. He set the case file down and leaned back in his chair. "You're 17. This is your third time in my courtroom this year. What is it this time?" Elijah stood at the defendant's table, his hands gripping the edge. He was tall for his age, lean but wiry, dressed in a plain collared shirt his mother had ironed that morning. His brown eyes stayed locked on the judge, calm but unwavering. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man in a stiff gray suit, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant is being charged with trespassing on private property and disorderly conduct at the Crescent Park shopping plaza." Judge Calloway sighed. "Let me guess. Skateboarding, making a scene, and arguing with security?" "That is correct," the prosecutor confirmed. The judge smirked, shaking his head. "Do you ever get tired, Elijah? Or do you just enjoy wasting everyone's time?" Elijah's jaw tightened. His public defender, a woman with tired eyes and an overflowing briefcase, nudged his arm. "Just let it go," she whispered. "Pleading guilty is the easiest route here." But Elijah wasn't interested in easy. He had spent the last 5 months preparing for this moment. 10 minutes earlier, outside the courtroom, Elijah had paced the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd known this was coming. He'd known since the day security dragged him out of that shopping plaza that he'd be standing here again. But this time, things were different. This time, he had a plan. For months, Elijah had been learning the ins and outs of courtroom arguments from his next-door neighbor, Mr. Whitmore, a retired defense attorney. What started as casual conversations had turned into a full-fledged mentorship. Every evening after school, Elijah would sit in Mr. Whitmore's study, watching case files pile up on the coffee table as he learned about objections, precedents, and legal loopholes. Now, standing before the judge, he inhaled sharply. It was time to put that knowledge to use. Judge Calloway rubbed his temple. "Mr. Moore, before I hand down yet another community service sentence you probably won't complete, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Elijah straightened his posture. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." A flicker of amusement crossed the judge's face. "Oh? And what is it this time?" Elijah took a steady breath and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, I would like to challenge the prosecution's case." The courtroom fell silent. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Judge Calloway chuckled, a dry, unimpressed sound. "Challenge the prosecution's case? Son, this isn't a TV show. You have a public defender for a reason." Elijah kept his eyes level. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I have the right to speak in my own defense." The judge leaned forward, intrigued but skeptical. "Fine, let's hear it. What could you possibly argue?" Elijah turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Bennett, you mentioned that I was trespassing on private property at Crescent Park Shopping Plaza. Could you clarify the exact location where this allegedly took place?" Bennett blinked, as if caught off guard. "The parking lot in front of Baxter's Sporting Goods." Elijah nodded. "And who owns that lot?" Bennett frowned. "The Crescent Park Management Company." Elijah reached into his pocket and carefully unfolded a piece of paper. "Actually, according to the county's property records, that parking lot is categorized as a public easement, not strictly private property." He stepped forward and handed the document to the judge's clerk, meaning, "I wasn't trespassing at all." Murmurs rippled through the small courtroom. Judge Calloway studied the document, his expression hardening. He wasn't used to teenagers knowing how to cite property records. He flicked his gaze back to Elijah. "Where did you get this?" Elijah met his eye steadily. "Public records are available to anyone who requests them, Your Honor." The judge exhaled slowly. "All right, you got lucky with that one. But what about the disorderly conduct charge? The security officer stated that you refused to leave when asked and caused a scene." Elijah clasped his hands together. "That depends, Your Honor. Under Georgia law, disorderly conduct requires intent to provoke a violent or disruptive response. I simply asked why I was being asked to leave, when I hadn't violated any rules. If asking a question is considered disorderly, then wouldn't that be an issue of free speech? Judge Calloway's fingers drummed against the bench. The kid wasn't just playing games, he had actually studied. He glanced at the prosecutor. Mr. Bennett, do you have video evidence of him causing a public disturbance? Bennett hesitated. The only footage we have shows the security officer and the defendant talking before he was escorted out. There was no physical altercation. Elijah seized the moment. Then I ask, Your Honor, without trespassing or any disruptive behavior on record, what exactly am I being charged with? A thick silence settled over the courtroom. Even Elijah's public defender was staring at him now, her exhaustion replaced with curiosity. 5 minutes later, Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. Mr. Moore, I don't know where you learned all this, but I have to admit, I'm impressed. Elijah remained silent, his heart pounding. The judge turned to Bennett. Without substantial evidence, I see no grounds to proceed. The case is dismissed. Elijah exhaled, but the judge wasn't finished. But I have a question, son. Who taught you all this? Elijah hesitated for a split second before answering. I learned by studying, Your Honor. Judge Calloway narrowed his eyes. Studying what? Google articles? YouTube videos? Elijah shook his head. Public case records, trial transcripts, legal handbooks. He paused, then added, and I had a little help from my neighbor, Mr. Whitmore. He used to be a defense attorney. The judge sat up straighter at the name. Whitmore? As in Gregory Whitmore? Elijah nodded. A low chuckle escaped Calloway's lips. Well, that explains it. I went up against Whitmore in court years ago. He was a sharp one. He eyed Elijah, his amusement shifting into something more thoughtful. So he's been teaching you? Elijah shrugged. Not in a classroom way, more like answering my questions and letting me sit in on some of his case reviews. The judge leaned back, rubbing his chin. And what exactly are you planning to do with all this legal knowledge? Elijah squared his shoulders. I want to be a lawyer. The courtroom murmur started up again, a mixture of surprise and intrigue. Even Elijah's public defender was staring at him differently now, like she hadn't expected to hear that from a kid who had just been on trial. The judge tapped his fingers on the bench. Let me get this straight. You're 17, already learning how to argue legal technicalities, and you've been mentored by one of the best defense attorneys in the state? Elijah nodded. Calloway exhaled sharply. Son, you had me fooled. I thought you were just another reckless kid wasting my time. Turns out you were preparing for this moment all along. Elijah didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Mr. Bennett, you agree that the charges don't hold? Bennett, clearly flustered, adjusted his tie. That's correct, Your Honor. Calloway turned back to Elijah. You're free to go. But before you leave, let me give you a piece of advice. He leaned forward. You're smart, smarter than most. But don't just use that intelligence to get yourself out of trouble. Use it to make something of yourself. Elijah met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. I will, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Court is adjourned. 30 minutes later, Elijah stepped out of the courthouse, inhaling the warm Georgia air. His hands were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, but beneath the nerves was something new. Pride. As he walked down the steps, a familiar voice called out. Well, that was something. Elijah turned to see Mr. Whitmore leaning against a pillar, arms crossed. The older man's sharp eyes twinkled with amusement. You were there? Elijah asked. Whitmore smirked. Oh, I wouldn't have missed it for the world. You handled yourself well, kid. Elijah allowed a small smile. Thanks. I guess I owe you for all those late-night case reviews. Whitmore shook his head. You don't owe me a thing. Just promise me one thing. When you do become a lawyer, make sure you never forget where you came from. Elijah nodded. I won't. For the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. 2 weeks later, Elijah sat on the front porch of his small, weathered house, flipping through an old legal textbook Mr. Whitmore had lent him. The past 2 weeks had been surreal, his case dismissed, the judge acknowledging his potential, and people looking at him differently. For the first time, he wasn't just some troubled teenager, he was someone with a future. Still at it, huh? Elijah looked up to see Mr. Whitmore walking up the driveway, holding 2 bottled sodas. He tossed one to Elijah, who caught it easily. "Yeah," Elijah said, twisting off the cap. "Figured I might as well keep learning." Whitmore sat down beside him on the porch steps. "Good, because I have a proposition for you." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "A proposition?" The older man took a sip of his drink. "I was impressed by how you handled yourself in court. More than that, so was Judge Calloway." Elijah's eyes widened. "The judge? What does he have to do with this?" Whitmore smirked. "He called me a few days ago. Said he'd never seen a kid argue a case like that, especially not one who'd been in and out of trouble. He thinks you've got real potential." Elijah's heartbeat quickened. "So, what does that mean?" Whitmore set his drink down. "It means that if you're serious about pursuing law, there's a program at the courthouse, an internship for high school students interested in the legal system. You'd be working directly with attorneys, sitting in on trials, even assisting with case research." Elijah blinked. "You're kidding." "Not in the slightest." Whitmore studied him carefully. "Calloway pulled some strings to get you a shot. But it's up to you whether you take it or not." Elijah stared down at the textbook in his lap. A year ago, he never would have imagined a judge, especially one like Calloway, offering him an opportunity like this. He had spent so much of his life being told he was a troublemaker, that he was destined for failure. And yet, here he was, being handed a chance to prove them all wrong. Finally, he looked up, determination shining in his eyes. "When do I start?" Whitmore chuckled. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." 1 month later, Elijah stood inside the courthouse, dressed in a neatly pressed button-down shirt and khakis. The courtroom bustled with attorneys preparing for hearings, their voices a mixture of authority and urgency. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. Elijah Moore? He turned to see a woman in a navy blazer approaching him. She extended a hand. "I'm Assistant District Attorney Rachel Monroe. I'll be supervising your internship." Elijah shook her hand firmly. "Nice to meet you, ma'am." She nodded approvingly. "Let's get started. We have a lot to teach you." As Elijah followed her down the hallway, he couldn't help but smile. For the first time in his life, he wasn't standing in court as a defendant. He was stepping into his future. 3 months later, Elijah hurried through the courthouse hallway, clutching a thick case file against his chest. He had spent the past few months shadowing attorneys, researching legal precedents, and even helping organize case documents. Every day felt like a new challenge, but he loved it. More. Elijah turned to see Ada Rachel Monroe waving him over. She stood outside a courtroom, her expression unreadable. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked as he approached. She handed him a document. "Judge Calloway wants this reviewed before the next hearing. Can you summarize the key points in the next 20 minutes?" Elijah's eyes flickered with surprise but also excitement. She was trusting him with real casework. "I'll get it done." Monroe gave him a brief nod. "Good. You're catching on fast." Elijah found an empty bench in the hallway and flipped through the document, his mind racing through everything he had learned. 3 months ago, he had been defending himself in this very courthouse. Now he was part of the system, but in a way he never expected. 1 hour later, Elijah stood at the back of Judge Calloway's courtroom, observing as the proceedings unfolded. Monroe sat at the prosecution table, presenting her argument, while the defense attorney countered. Elijah focused on their strategies, the way they structured their arguments. Calloway's gaze flickered toward him briefly, a knowing glint in his eyes. He hadn't forgotten how Elijah had once stood in that same spot as a defendant. Finally, after ruling on the case, the judge motioned for Elijah to step forward. "How's the internship treating you?" Calloway asked as he gathered his notes. Elijah straightened his posture. "It's been incredible, Your Honor. I'm learning more than I ever thought possible." Calloway smirked. "Figured you might." He closed his case folder and fixed Elijah with a serious look. "You know, not many people get a second chance to redefine themselves. You took yours and ran with it. That's rare." Elijah nodded, his voice steady. "I don't plan on wasting it." Calloway studied him for a moment before giving a satisfied nod. "Good. Because something tells me this courthouse hasn't seen the last of you." As Elijah stepped out of the courtroom, he felt a sense of certainty settle over him. Judge Calloway was right. This was only the beginning. 6 months later, Elijah stood in front of a crowded conference room inside the courthouse, his palms slightly sweaty. Before him sat a group of high school students, most of them kids like him, who had been labeled as troublemakers, written off by their schools, or sent to juvenile court more times than they could count. He cleared his throat. Hey everyone, my name's Elijah Moore, and, well, a year ago, I was sitting where you are right now. Some of the students shifted in their seats, looking at him with mild skepticism. Others leaned forward, curious. Elijah smiled slightly. I know what you're thinking. Oh, great! Another speech about making better choices, but that's not what I'm here for. I'm here because I want you to know that what people say about you doesn't have to define you. The room went quiet. Last year I was in court for the third time, Elijah continued. Judge Calloway thought I was just another lost cause. Honestly, so did a lot of people. But I had someone who believed in me. My neighbor, Mr. Whitmore. He taught me that the law isn't just something used to punish people. It's something that can protect people, too. He glanced at Judge Calloway, who was standing at the back of the room with his arms crossed, watching silently. I spent months studying legal cases, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand how the system really works, Elijah said. And when I walked into court that day, I didn't just stand there and take whatever sentence was handed to me. I defended myself. A few kids raised their eyebrows. 1 month later, I was interning at this courthouse. 6 months later, I was sitting in on real trials, working with attorneys, and learning what it really means to fight for justice. He scanned the room, making eye contact with each of them. And now, I'm here to tell you that if you think your life is already set in stone, it's not. You get to decide who you want to be. A long silence followed. Then, a kid in the back, maybe 15, wearing a hoodie too big for him, raised his hand. So you're saying we can be lawyers too? Elijah grinned. I'm saying you can be whatever you want. But if you're interested in law, this courthouse has a mentorship program, and if you're serious about it, I'll help you. The room murmured with excitement. Judge Calloway stepped forward then. His usual stern expression softened. I expect to see some of you in this program next month, he said. Then, glancing at Elijah, he added, and I expect you to keep leading the way more. Elijah nodded, a sense of purpose filling him. This was what he was meant to do. And he wasn't going to stop. 1 year later, Elijah stood at the front of a packed courtroom, wearing a crisp suit that fit him perfectly, a far cry from the teenager who had stumbled into this very place just a year ago. He adjusted his tie, his heart racing in his chest. Today was a big day. Judge Calloway was seated on the bench, his gaze steady as ever. Elijah had grown accustomed to the judge's presence over the past year. He had become a mentor of sorts, guiding Elijah through his transformation from troubled teen to law student. Today, however, Elijah wasn't just an intern or a kid looking for a second chance. He was here for something bigger. Across the courtroom, a defendant sat nervously, his attorney whispering final advice before the trial started. Elijah had spent hours researching his case, analyzing evidence, and preparing arguments. This wasn't just about impressing anyone anymore. This was about making a real difference. Are you ready? Elijah turned to see Rachel Monroe, the ADA who had been his supervisor throughout his internship, standing next to him. She had become a mentor in her own right, and her belief in him had been unwavering from the start. He took a deep breath. I think so. I've been preparing for this moment for a long time. She smiled, her eyes softening. You've earned it. Just remember, you don't have to have all the answers right away. You've got the tools now. Trust your instincts. Elijah nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He was ready. As the judge called the court to order, Elijah stepped forward. The familiar hum of the courtroom, the shuffle of papers, and the soft murmur of conversations faded as all eyes turned to him. He could feel the intensity of the room, but this time, he welcomed it. He wasn't that nervous kid anymore. Your Honor, members of the jury, Elijah began, his voice strong and clear. The case before you today is about more than just the facts. It's about justice and the principle that everyone deserves to be heard fairly. As he spoke, Elijah could see the skepticism begin to melt from some of the jurors' faces. His words were measured, but each sentence carried weight. He knew this wasn't just a performance. This was about making sure justice was truly served. He presented the evidence with confidence, outlining the timeline, highlighting inconsistencies in the prosecution's claims, and pointing out critical facts that had been overlooked. With each passing moment, he felt his connection to the law deepen. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about understanding the responsibility that came with the profession. The trial went smoothly, and Elijah felt himself settling into the role. At times, it was a struggle to keep his nerves at bay, but each victory, however small, gave him the strength to continue. Finally, after several hours, it was time for closing arguments. Elijah's closing statement was simple but powerful. He didn't just summarize the facts, he reminded the jury of their duty to look beyond the surface, to see the truth that was often hidden beneath the noise. The jury deliberated, and within the hour they returned with their verdict. "Not guilty," the foreperson declared. Elijah's heart swelled with pride, but it wasn't the victory that mattered most. It was the journey that had led him here, the one that had begun with a judge's mockery and ended with the trust of a courtroom. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Calloway approached him, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did good, Moore," he said, offering a firm handshake. "Real good." Elijah looked up at him, the weight of those words sinking in. "Thank you, Your Honor. I couldn't have done it without you." Calloway nodded. "You've earned your place here, don't forget that." Elijah stood tall, knowing that his future, no, his calling, was just beginning. Elijah's journey teaches us that it's never too late to change your path. With determination, mentorship, and a willingness to learn, you can transform your circumstances and build a future filled with possibilities. Never underestimate the power of second chances. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notification to be the first to know when the next story drops.